Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Compass in cooperation with Cotidianul TV, here live from Bucharest. Hello, Professor Komaroff. Welcome to my podcast today here live on Compass. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thanks so much for having me.
Professor Komaroff, it's such an honor that you accepted my invitation in my today's podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce, first of all, Mr. Professor Anthony Komaroff from Boston. You are the Simcox Clifford highly distinguished professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School and a senior physician at Birmingham Women's Hospital. You also held several leadership positions, including you're also the director of the Division of General Medicine and Primary Care within the Department of Medicine at the Birmingham Women's Hospital. Then you're the founding editor of the journal Watch General Medicine, a publication of the New England Journal of Medicine since 1987. You're also editor-in-chief of the Harvard Health Publications Division of the Harvard Medical School, responsible for all Harvard Medical School's consumer health publishing. You have published over 270 research articles, book chapters, 2 books, and served as editor of autobiographies of 2 Nobel laureates on the Harvard Medical School faculty. That's an impressive career path and really a true honor that you accepted my invitation.
It's
Most probably I've left
here.
something out. I apologize for that.
No, that's fine.
For centuries, you've been investigating several syndromes which now, because of the pandemic, are back to the present, are very actual, particularly the myalgic encephalomyelitis and chronic fatigue syndrome. So what is your impression? You started about, let's say, 40 years ago already with a small number of doctors and researchers because you're interested in the chronic fatigue syndrome. What has changed since then? And why is CFS so important nowadays in the context of COVID?
Well, 40 years ago, by chance, I saw in my medical practice several patients who were healthy young adults. They came down with some sort of flu-like illness, didn't seem very different from other illnesses that they'd had in the past. But the difference this time was that it was now 6 months, 9 months, a year later, and they had never recovered fully the full health. Something about that initial infection that seemed like just a regular infection at the time turned out to be different. They were not recovering fully. And that got me interested, and I learned that several other groups, one at the National Institutes of Health and one in Denver and one in Atlanta, Georgia, were also seeing patients like this. And so we became interested in trying to figure out what was going on. What we did not know at that time was that if you go into the medical literature, similar post-infectious fatigue syndromes had been reported in the medical literature in the past, following different well-documented acute infections with viruses, different viruses, with bacteria, even with protozoa. So it seemed like we were dealing with an illness that was more a dysfunctional response to an infection rather than an illness caused by a single novel infectious agent, in the way that HIV proved to be the single important cause for AIDS. So that's the way it was at the beginning. We had never heard, we were unfamiliar with these previously reported post-infectious fatigue syndromes until we started learning about it. And most of my colleagues, even the ones in the infectious disease division, were really not aware of this. And the textbooks said very little, if anything, about it. So the change, to answer your question, is that today, I think practically everyone, every doctor and many people have heard about both ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, and now long COVID in the last 2 years. And so we are all familiar with it. And I think we're beginning to understand what is going wrong in the body that leads to the symptoms of these illnesses.
I mean, one cannot put enough the emphasis on the relevance of the symptoms because, unfortunately, from the very beginning of the pandemic, many people underestimated the severeness of this disease and confused flu-like symptoms with a flu, which are it's obviously a completely different kettle of fish. And I think many people really got sick because they had this misconception, I mean, lacking information. They thought, well, it's an easy flu, and why are governments shutting down and closing down everything? Because they were not familiar with that, and they could not imagine that not everything starting with flu-like symptoms is necessarily a flu. And now we are in a different situation because recovering from COVID-19 does not guarantee one necessarily a return to a person's usual state of health, isn't it?
That's correct. That's right. I think in a way, many people underestimated two things. One was how severe the initial acute infection with COVID-19 would be. And the other was how many people would have who recovered from the acute infection would remain with a chronic illness that really seriously interfered with their lives, interfered with their ability to work and their responsibilities at home.
Is it possible to ask correctly how common are these post-COVID-19 symptoms, or is this post-COVID-19 illness? Because maybe we would have had different figures a year ago, and we might have, again, different, even rising numbers next year. I mean, looking back to, let's say, the 20s and 30s, to the epidemic of the encephalitis lethargica, the symptoms with various patients, and that's what scientists, physicians back then said, they sometimes change from a day to the other.
Right. Yeah, it's a very hard thing to get solid numbers about. And it depends a lot on how you ask the questions. Whether people are saying, yes, I have some lingering symptoms, or if they're saying, these symptoms are seriously interfering with my life. I am not able to do the work that I used to do. I am not able to fulfill all of my responsibilities to my family. So it depends a little bit how the questions are asked. And I think the very best studies are underway, but have not yet been completed. So we don't have solid answers. Based on what we know so far, I think we can say that anywheres from 7% to 25 to 30% of people following acute COVID remain with some symptoms that are bothersome, that are definitely, that lead them to say, I have not returned to full health a year after they got over the acute COVID. So that's what we know. What we don't know yet, and it's very important, is how long these symptoms will last. Because in terms of the impact on society, if the symptoms will be gone a year from now, that's one thing. If the symptoms will remain with people for most of the rest of their lives, then the impact on them and on society is going to be far greater. And we just don't know that yet. With myalgic encephalomyelitis, or chronic fatigue syndrome, the best studies, unfortunately, are that most people do not fully recover for the rest of their lives. If that happens to prove true for long COVID, then its impact on society will be very large. And we just don't know yet. There are some signs that it may not be as long-lasting, long COVID may not be as long-lasting as ME or chronic fatigue syndrome, but it's too early to say for sure.
At this moment, while looking at the numbers only, what would you say is the biggest difficulty on collecting correct and proper numbers? Is it also the lacking willingness of patients to cooperate, in terms that people might again underestimate symptoms and say, well, it was a flu, I feel a bit tired because it's springtime. Where do you see the difficulties in, first of all, getting correct numbers?
I think that the perfect study you would take every single patient who ever got acute COVID, and they would all agree to have you continue to follow them for years, for many years, and periodically asking them questions, periodically performing tests. Obviously, in the real world, the perfect study will never happen. Most people with ME/CFS and most people with long COVID so far have been willing participants in ongoing studies of their illness because they want to do everything they can to help learn what's causing the illness and obviously how to make it better. So but it's going to require very large numbers of patients and a lot of expense in conducting the medical studies. In the United States, the National Institutes of Health has set aside over $1 billion just to study the long-term effects of COVID-19. So it's going to be very expensive, and I don't think we will have solid results for another 2 years at least.
I spoke recently to a professor for psychology. He's an expert on social psychology, and we spoke about the possibility, well, I'm not familiar with that, about the possibility of having these modern watches monitoring the sleep and the heart rate, having such gadgets sending data and helping monitoring potential long COVID patients, because he told me that even such simple gadgets may send some relevant information which could help to better estimate long COVID in society.
Yes, I agree with him. I think even beyond smart watches doing that, you will see over the next 10 years a whole new kind of clinical research conducted with electronic skin. People will wear a tape on their skin that will be monitoring not just heart rate, but also blood oxygen levels and EKGs and EEGs and a whole variety of, and some blood levels of glucose and other metabolites in the blood. This is already happening to a small degree. It's a hot area. Wearables, electronic skin or wearables. Human beings will be constantly monitored by these wearables, this electronic skin, and that will become a routine part of many ongoing clinical research studies, not just studies of long COVID, but studies of all types.
Even nanotechnology may at some extent detect and send such data in real time to several devices and have the patients monitored.
Exactly.
I mean, in case of long COVID, without knowing now how the symptoms might develop in future, I think it's, first of all, good that at least technology is getting ready now for the case, even for a worst case scenario, isn't it?
Yes, I agree.
Who is more likely to become a so-called long hauler?
Yeah. I think we have pretty good data on that question. And the answer is people who are at greater risk during acute COVID. So that means people, for example, with various chronic illnesses of the heart or lungs or diabetes or obesity, and also people who were the very sickest with acute COVID are more likely to develop long COVID. But they're not the only ones who will develop long COVID. Unfortunately, even people very mildly ill with acute COVID, some of those people will go on to develop long COVID. It's just not as many of the mildly ill people are at risk for long COVID as the number of people with severe acute COVID are at risk for long COVID.
At some extent, scientists compare long COVID also with the encephalitis lethargica, actually often called epidemic encephalitis. At the time of the epidemic, that was a prevalent worldwide disease during the years 1918 to 1930. And the acute phase was actually characterized also by somnolence and also COVID-like symptoms. Do you think that all these comparisons which are drawn at present with EL are at some extent useful?
I think the comparisons are useful, and I would go one step further and say that it's hard today, of course, to know what the truth was of encephalitis lethargica, because the technologies for studying disease today were not available a century ago. But I think it's very likely that there is a shared pathophysiology between encephalitis lethargica and these chronic post-infectious fatigue syndromes. I think I've just submitted a paper for publication comparing the number of underlying biological abnormalities that are shared by ME/CFS on one hand and by long COVID on the other hand. They are very, very similar, not only in terms of their symptoms, but also very similar in terms of the underlying biological abnormalities in those illnesses. And I think the same will prove to be true of other post-infectious fatigue syndromes.
Surprisingly, scientists back to, let's say, the 20s and 30s, they've observed autoimmune processes, particularly in the brainstem, if I'm not mistaken. And these neuropathological symptoms which they have observed in diseased patients, they resemble at some extent what physicians are observing nowadays in the brain of people who have died of COVID-19.
You're right. One of the most exciting discoveries in the last few years in this field has been the discovery in mice, not in humans yet, but in mice, of nuclei, small groups of neurons in the brainstem and in the hypothalamus that, when they are stimulated, produce the symptoms of sickness, of illness, like fatigue and loss of appetite and aching muscles and aching joints and headaches. The brainstem and possibly the hypothalamus both appear involved in rodents, and I think likely in humans, to cause many of these symptoms of post-infectious fatigue syndromes. So my guess is that that's where the symptoms come from. You mentioned autoimmunity. Certainly autoantibodies directed at targets in the brain, including targets in the brainstem and in the hypothalamus, could be stimulating these neurons that produce the symptoms that we're talking about. That's theoretically very possible. It's a very hard thing to study and prove in living human beings. You can study it in the mice because the animals are sacrificed and you can study their brains, but we don't do that with human research. So it's a tougher thing to prove conclusively in humans, but nevertheless, I think it's a real possibility.
What physicians also observed in the case of EL, that the symptoms in some cases persisted without respite to the chronic state. In others, they developed weeks, months, or even years after the patient was thought to have recovered. And then about 5 to 10 years later, there were increasing numbers of Parkinsonism after the encephalitis lethargica. So might this autoimmune reaction in the brainstem have been responsible for the Parkinson disease after EL?
Yes, I think that's a very real possibility. But again, proving it in humans when you're talking about an illness that occurred a century ago would be nearly impossible. All you can say is there are reasons to believe it's plausible.
I came across a PhD thesis from 1937, and I'd love to quote the author. It's called The Parkinson Syndrome of Epidemic Encephalitis. That's the synonym of the disease. And he said about 10 years later, that's what he said, well, it revealed that those in whose cases the diagnosis was well established were almost all dead or helpless, and that the incidence of complete recovery was highest in those in whom the clinical picture was atypical and the diagnosis doubtful. That links it close to what you have said about COVID. One gains the impression, therefore, that if we exclude errors in diagnosis, the outlook of continued good health in epidemic encephalitis type A is very bad indeed. Well, he says then this is, of course, only the writer's opinion and is not shared by all authorities. But that's quite a pessimistic outlook. I mean, we're talking about a PhD thesis from 1937. Not all scientists who have investigated EL starting with 1918 remained investigating it till the late 30s. There wasn't necessarily a sort of continuity of the scientists. So apparently that was another severe challenge, and another challenge was dealing with the names. The nomenclature aspect was creating severe difficulties as well.
I didn't know that history.
I recommend articles written by Bramwell and McNulty and Basson. And back to 1919, an author, he was unhappy with the names. And they even said the name lethargic makes no sense because the disease cannot be lethargic. Part of the patients are lethargic.
Right.
So he said we should rather call it the epidemic encephalitis. So apparently this name created a lot of confusion among physicians.
Well, and the name chronic fatigue syndrome also has been very, I think, is a terrible name. And I was one of the people who, the group that came up with that name. But in retrospect, I think that was a very bad decision because because every human being experiences fatigue. And so many people said, well, chronic fatigue syndrome, we all have chronic fatigue syndrome, and it trivialized an illness that in fact is terribly debilitating and even in some people disabling.
So apparently this type of debate dealing with such syndromes is a never-ending story. And I think it's very important, your contribution in having proposed yet giving to it a different name, because it's creating confusions and is misleading, obviously.
Yes. Yeah, I think the most important things for physicians to know about both ME/CFS and long COVID is that since both of these illnesses are defined only by symptoms, it's fair for any doctor, any person to ask, well, if it's fine, you can say you have symptoms, but is there anything objective that we can measure, anything biological that's wrong, that could be explaining your symptoms? And at first, in studying both of these illnesses, the answer to that was no. We haven't yet found anything biologically wrong. But today, in 2023, I think we can say with confidence, in both of these illnesses, there are multiple things that are wrong in the central nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, the immune system, and with metabolism, with energy metabolism in particular, as well as abnormalities of the gut microbiome that in some people may be the primary cause of the illness and the symptoms. So the day has come when we can say these illnesses have an underlying set of biological abnormalities. They are not, the symptoms are not being simply imagined by the patients. The symptoms are real and have real underlying biological causes. What we don't know yet is, how does all of this abnormal biology connect to one another? How do the abnormalities in the brain, how are they influenced by the metabolic abnormalities, and vice versa? We're just beginning to understand that, and we need to understand that before we're going to have effective treatments.
About 2.5 years ago, the current Minister of Health of Germany, Professor Karl Lauterbach, also a physician, he posted on Twitter a warning saying that after COVID, we may expect problems similar to those problems which appeared after the Spanish flu, and he referred to the encephalitis lethargica. Well, others would have contradicted him in terms of saying that that EL was not linked to influenza, but that's more of a detailed aspect. But it's important that he made this warning publicly June or July 2020. So experts must have observed from the very beginning of the pandemic that such consequences might be possible.
Absolutely. And in July of 2020, perhaps the best known American infectious disease physician, Dr. Anthony Fauci, also on CNN said exactly the same thing as the German Minister of Health, not just theoretically, but because they were beginning, Dr. Fauci was beginning to see in the patients at the National Institutes of Health, people who had recovered from acute COVID, but were still badly affected by chronic symptoms. And so he was witnessing this. Dr. Fauci himself had been seeing post-infectious fatigue syndromes following other infections for many decades. And so he was well familiar with this class of illnesses. So yes, the number of people made this prediction. We in late 2020 published a paper predicting that the number of cases of a chronic fatigue syndrome-like illness in the United States caused by COVID would more than double the number of cases in the United States within a year. And that has proved to be an underestimate.
I mean, over the next years, for sure, physicians will observe and also get a better understanding of the symptoms and the physiological processes which are taking place. But I think at a similar extent, also psychologists and psychiatrists will have to deal with problems of violence in a society, because encephalitis lethargica was also associated with a changing behavior. Like Professor Paul Foley has said, it's a virus infection of brain and mind, and our societies were faced also a rising number of very aggressive people with a complete change behavior. So it's not the fatigue syndrome. It may be also, if I'm not mistaken, the other way around, and having a complete behavior change to the detriment of the individual and of the society.
I think in this case, I don't see any evidence in my own clinical experience taking care of patients with post-infectious fatigue syndromes that they are more inclined to impulsive behavior, including violent outbursts. I don't see this in these patients or in the long COVID patients. It may be one of the subtle differences between encephalitis lethargica and its effects on the brain and these other post-infectious fatigue syndromes. There's a lot of evidence that impulsive behavior, including violent impulsive behavior, it reflects abnormalities of the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And it may be that encephalitis lethargica was more likely to affect that part of the brain than many other post-infectious fatigue syndromes are.
So if the frontal part of the brain is more confronted or affected, then also this aspect of violence may occur. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. In case of EL, most of these affected were young people, more than adults affected of violence. So I have no idea how this may turn in case of long COVID.
A slight increased vulnerability for older people. But on the other hand, older people were also more likely to become severely ill with acute COVID. So it's very hard to tease out whether age was really important or whether it was how severely ill they were with acute COVID that makes long COVID more vulnerable, more likely.
Professor Komaroff, thank you very much for this interview. Thank you so much for your contribution, which is so precious and valuable to offer, first of all, a better understanding, to offer a better medical prospect in future for the patients, and also helping people to understand the relevance of your research and to take really seriously these matters, because not everything resembling a flu is a flu. And I like very much the way you've explained, the way you communicated, and I hope that people will double listen to what you've said.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Golban, for having me. And I hope I've explained myself and put into context these very difficult illnesses.
Because you called my PhD title, it's a PhD in economics. I just did my best for this interview, preparing such a sophisticated subject with a distinguished professor of medicine from the Harvard Medical School.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure talking to you, and have a nice day and best greetings to Boston. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.